it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Roman, I'm going to say it right, Krznaric. I don't know why, I'm Danish. I normally can do any words, but
that was pretty close. You just say every letter without fear, and it's Krznaric, yes.
Krznaric, to our book club. He's written what I think is a brilliant book called The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in the Short-Term World. And it's very rare, I think, for this type of book to be as practical as yours is and as beautifully written. So thank you. I hope many of you have had a chance to read it in advance. If not, please ask questions and elaborations if you don't understand what we're asking. But as Natalie says, we'll kick off, and I will pass over to Roman just to tell me a little bit about why you wrote this book and what it's about, if you were going to give us a summary for those who might not have got through the whole thing or got hold of it.
Sure. So hello, everybody, and thank you for coming along wherever you are in the world. I'm in Oxford, in Oxford, UK, not Oxford, Mississippi, in my garden office. So yes, I've written this book called The Good Ancestor. Now, why? I kind of wrote it partly out of a sense of frustration, because I don't know if you felt this, but for the last few years, I've been picking up newspapers, looking at online media sources, and constantly I see this complaint that there's too much short-term thinking going on and we need more long-term thinking, whether it's people in business or politics or in the tech world or people working in the health service or school teachers, whatever. So much complaint about this myopia of the world we live in, and that we're constantly clicking the buy now button, looking at our phones, which is all true. And what I noticed was that everyone kept saying, well, we need more long-term thinking, don't we? But nobody seemed to be saying, well, what long-term thinking really is. Are there different kinds of long-term thinking? Is it always good for us? Can you get better at it? Can we even do it as human beings? Can we really think decades, even centuries ahead and plan that far? So in a way, what I set out to do in this book was to try and do a kind of, I guess, anatomy of long-term thinking, try and create a conceptual framework for it to enable us to think about long-term thinking. So it partly came out of that. It partly also, I think, just came out of the fact that I've got kids. I've got twins who've just turned 12. And, well, if you think about it, I mean, if you've got nephews or nieces or children or grandchildren or young people in your life, that if they're about the age of my kids, well, they could well be alive in the year 2100. And if they have children or grandchildren, those children or grandchildren could be alive well into the 22nd century. So the future is not science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And I think if you really start feeling that in your bones, as I do, if I picture my daughter on her 90th birthday party, surrounded by family and friends, I go and look out the window. Well, what's going on out the window? Is it a world on fire, or is it the Jetsons? What do I see? But whatever it is, we know we live at this extraordinary moment of history where probably there's never been a moment of history where our actions have had such impacts on the future, because of climate change and biodiversity loss, the impacts of new technology, artificial intelligence, the possibility of genetically engineered pandemics, nanotechnology, as well as the one we've had since July 16th, 1945. That's the nuclear button, when the first nuclear test went off. So we have this capacity to completely alter the lives of future generations. So that's partly why I wrote the book too, to sort of try and put our minds and our decision-making far into that future. Do I say one more thing? Sorry, Louise, I'm not giving you a chance to say anything, but just, one of the core ideas at the center of this book, which really motivated me, was a kind of a metaphor, which is the idea that we've colonized the future, that we treat it like a dumping ground for ecological degradation and technological risk, as if there was nobody there. And it's a little bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century. I'm actually Australian, so I sort of resonate with this metaphor. When Britain colonized Australia, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, which in fact is one of the recent episodes of the latest series of The Crown, if anybody binge watches it like me, there is one called Terra Nullius.
Yeah.
The idea that the continent was nobody's land, an uninhabited territory. There were no indigenous people, so they thought, of course there were. And I think what we've got alongside Tempus Nullius now is Terra Nullius. Alongside that, we have Tempus Nullius. So we see the future as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited place that's ours for the taking. And those future generations, we don't give them any political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. So in a way, we've got to decolonize the future, give them a voice.
Oh, that was, yeah, I have lots of questions already. Thank you. Let me start with the kind of, I guess, a little bit on the personal ones. You talked about your children. So are they, so I have children, and my older daughter definitely has suffered from a bit of, I guess it's called eco-anxiety with a proper name, that feeling of, oh my gosh, this is my future and there's so much coming at me. How do I cope with it? How are your children doing on that?
Yeah, I mean, my kids are pretty split on it, as it were. I mean, they both live in a household. My wife's an ecological economist, so we're talking about this stuff all the time. Kids, as I said, are 12, and we're pretty open with the way that we talk to them about the world's problems, but also the world's solutions. So the other night, we all sat down and watched the new film about Greta Thunberg called I Am Greta, which sort of follows her life really over the years since when she first stood outside of the Swedish parliament with her, climate strike placard to becoming a global ecological superstar. And that film, of course, through the film, Greta's saying, I want you to panic. She's not afraid of talking about the realities of the world. Yet at the same time, that the film, if anybody watches it, it's a really interesting film, is also full of hope, because you see tens of thousands of school kids on the streets in Brussels, in Rome, and my kids met Greta Thunberg actually in Rome last year. So for them, I think, particularly for my daughter, who's quite a kind of a climate activist, I don't think she feels trapped in a kind of a world of fear. I think she feels hopeful, partly because she's gone on climate strikes herself. And our son, he's not really interested in the politics of it, as it were. He's an obsessive architect, a budding architect. So he's trying to design for the future, I think, in a positive way. How do we create buildings? He's always drawing buildings of that are solar powered and all this kind of stuff. But there is, of course, an issue of how do you communicate this stuff with kids. But I think, I think I err on the side, and I think my partner does too, of sort of openness rather than trying to protect them too much.
Yeah.
They can handle it. In fact, they're more knowledgeable. I mean, in a deep sense of, they're more, the way I think about it, if I can get my words right, is I think of my kids as ecological natives. So me growing up in Australia in the 70s, 80s, whatever, I didn't grow up with that ecological sensibility that they have. In fact, my early interest was mostly in human rights. I wrote a PhD on Guatemalan politics and the Civil War in the 1990s. I've had to learn to care about the biosphere.
Yeah.
Right. So I think in a way, the journey's easier for them to sort of connect with the issues, with the problems, but also with the possibilities.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
Well, I mean, how is it for your kids? What's it?
Yeah, it's a split. Exactly that. It's a split where one is kind of anxious at times, but also has been really, really active in the UK SCN movement, both with strikes and organizing things at school and empowering herself through that. And actually that connectedness they get from the strikes has been incredible to watch, I think, that feeling of empowerment. Whereas, my son has kind of been more low key about it, done a bit through work. And then my youngest is, she's just taking it as it comes, I think, and saying, right, well, she's not being overwhelmed at all actually by it. And she's close to your children's age. So yeah, I think it's clearly individual, right? But I think one of the things for us lot who work and talk about this a lot, it's so important that we don't infect them with our pessimism and overwhelm,
Yeah.
or on the other hand, kind of fake optimism that, oh, it's all going to be fine, just ignore it and live on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's about giving kids a sense of agency. So, for example, you know, at the end of 2019, during the time of the UK general election, my partner and I decided to give our votes in the election to our kids who were then aged 11. So we sat around the kitchen table and we debated the party manifestos and discussed the electoral system, you know, for ages. And they then each told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And in fact, in the end, they didn't exactly follow their parents' political opinions either.
Oh, how did that feel?
But I think that sense of agency was really important. They're not just on the receiving end of the world that is coming their way.
Yes.
And of course, we did that because what I was talking about the way we've colonized the future, the way we don't give future generations rights. We felt that we should do what the political system isn't doing, which is them kind of giving them a voice. And I think they really enjoyed that. You know, and in fact, one of the things we did, we got them just to present the views of different parties, and we had all the manifestos out, and we had really, really good discussions. You know, even though they were only 11, you know, they were, I was just impressed by their sort of openness and engagement and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, and it is that thing. I think children can cope with a lot more than we anticipate. A friend of mine always quotes, and she says that children in Greenland can gut fish with sharp knives at the age of 4.5. So we shouldn't be overprotecting them. And I think that goes for the mental sense too. They can cope with a lot. I'm going to jump a little bit because you jumped straight into one of the things we've discussed as our team, and I think it's Richard who held on to this idea of the colonial mindset and said, well, kind of, can we learn anything from the anti-colonial movements and anti-slavery? Is this a successor that we can actually, we've done this before, we can stop it? Or is it different, the way we're colonizing the future?
It's a really, really interesting question, actually. I mean, I guess my immediate response to that is what we can learn from is from the perspectives of those who've been colonized in the past, you know, particularly. I mean, I guess that's the obvious answer, isn't it? So, for example, you know, there's the Native American idea of seventh generation decision making, which is used today in Iroquois communities, Lakota Nation peoples. And, you know, seventh generation decision making is not something, you know, so that's the idea of a kind of sense of ecological stewardship, which sends your mind forward maybe 150, 200 years. And we can take an idea like that and then see if we can make it work in our own communities, you know, because there's a question there, right? Can you take this indigenous wisdom and then put it to work in the mega cities of, I don't know, Shanghai, Miami, Dubai, wherever? Interestingly, actually, there is a US company called Seventh Generation. It's a cleaning, they make cleaning products actually. And they have the idea of the seventh generation principle. I think it's carved into the window of their main meeting room. But just to give you another example, you know, outside the world of business, in Japan, there's this really amazing political movement called Future Design, and it's directly inspired by the seventh generation, you know, Native American idea. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. So it's all about local government decision making in a way. And then they tend to divide them into two groups. Half of them are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And they even give them these kind of ceremonial robes to wear, like kind of kimonos. And it turns out the residents imagining themselves from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, from healthcare investment to dealing with COVID to climate change action to confronting artificial intelligence and automation and aging, all sorts of stuff. And that movement, Future Design, is now spreading from small towns to major cities like Kyoto. It's being used, that methodology, in Japan's Ministry of Finance, and some companies are starting to pick up on it as well. So there is a way of, I guess, learning from our colonial heritage, let's say, trying to draw on indigenous wisdom of various types, and then see if we can make it work to inject the DNA of long-termism into our politics, our companies, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh. I'm seeing more questions come in. I'm trying to ignore them for the moment. I will just ignore a little bit.
Sure.
Actually, as you can see, John Elkington has just popped a question in, which is, what was the most surprising thing in writing the book? What has most surprised you?
I think the thing that most surprised me probably is, I'm just thinking.
That's fine.
You know what it is? You know what it is? It's this sense that over the years of writing, it took me 3 or 4 years to write this book. Over time, I started discovering all these different people who are really engaged in long-term thinking. It's like there's a movement of what I ended up calling time rebels in the book, people dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. When I started the book, I just didn't realize how many of them there were. I didn't really get the sense that there's a movement, but I think there is. So, give you examples like, okay, there's that future design movement in Japan I just mentioned, think of scientific projects like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. Or there's cultural projects like the Long Now Foundation in California, where I'm a research fellow, founded by Stuart Brand and Brian Eno and some others. They've got this project called the 10,000 Year Clock, and it's a slow time clock being built as we speak in the Texas desert. And it's being designed to last 10 millennia, stay accurate for 10 millennia. And you'll be able to visit it by walking through the desert, going up steps carved into the mountainside, each of them the equivalent of 1 million years of geological time. And you'll be able to visit this almost like a secular altarpiece for a long-term thinking civilization. So it's a kind of like an art project. So I started noticing all these different projects going on all over the place. And then when you combine it with, the incredible development of, for example, the circular economy movement around the world and regenerative economic thinking. Think of companies like Houdini in Sweden, right? Basically pretty much totally circular. They've got this amazing program where you can, they make, as some of you may know, make hiking jackets and skiing stuff. And when you finish with your Houdini 100% organic wool recyclable jacket, they've actually got this composting facility. So you can put your jacket in there, it turns into soil, and you can have a meal made out of your old clothes. They've served meals to their customers made out of their old clothes. Okay. And of course, this kind of regenerative mindset is a form of long-term thinking, of course, because it's all about working within the biocapacity of the one and only planet we know that sustains life. So it's implicitly long-term and sometimes explicitly. So when you put all those things together, I'm actually ended up finishing writing the book more hopeful than when I'd started, to come back to John's question. And I really do think there's a time rebel movement. But let me say one more thing about this, which I think is really important. I think, all of these different kinds of organizations that I just mentioned and I talk about in the book, they don't all know that they're time rebels, right? They don't all think of themselves in that way. And in a way, one of the things I still want to do with this book and the sort of the broader advocacy project, which is growing out of it, which I try and do with all my books, try and do more than just books, but create museums or artworks and other stuff. I kind of want to bring all those time rebels in a room together and tell them that they are all being good ancestors, that they are all time rebels. It's kind of, you kind of need a narrative, a label to describe who you are and what you're doing.
And I love that. And I guess if you do that, I was going to say, count us in. I'd love to help you bring that together. Presumably also amplifies the impact that each of these have, right? Just to know that they're all doing a similar, very different things, but with that good ancestor stamp of approval.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, it just reminds me, I haven't thought of this for ages, but years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was talking to a guy called Bill Drayton, who invented the concept of the social entrepreneur and founded the Ashoka Foundation, done lots of interesting stuff. And actually, this is probably about 10 years ago. And he said they were doing a lot of work at that time, Ashoka were, and Bill Drayton, on empathy and trying to get empathy taught almost like a school subject, particularly in the United States. And I'd written a book about empathy called Empathy, Why It Matters, How to Get It, and been involved in lots of empathy projects and founded an empathy museum and stuff like that. And Bill Drayton said to me, he said, look, we need to create a European empathy movement. How are we going to do this? And my immediate response to him was to say, look, that movement already exists. It exists in organizations working on domestic violence, women's refuges. It works with, already exists because there are projects about, refugees and asylum seekers. There are all sorts of projects dealing with bullying in the school playground. All of these were about empathy. You just needed to bring everyone in the room and tell them that they're part of an empathy revolution, right?
Yeah.
For exactly the reason that you say, you're not alone. And I think in a way, that's how a lot of social change needs to happen, to defragment it, as it were.
Yes, is that collective action. One more question before we really turn deep into the book. So one thing that strikes me about several of your books actually is that there's always a how-to, which I love because I like that practical side combined with the big thinking and the data. Is that the new role of philosophers, to do a bit more, or is it what it always was? I would love to just hear your thoughts on philosophy.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I'm not meaning to plug my own books, but in fact, I wrote a little book called How to Find Fulfilling Work. But actually, this is part of the answer to the question. This book was part of a series published by an organization called the School of Life, which I was one of the founding faculty members of that back in 2008. And the purpose of the School of Life, which was created by one of the main people behind it, is the philosopher Alain de Botton and some others. And the idea was really to try and create an alternative form of education to learn about the stuff you don't learn about in college. Like, how do you find a meaningful job? How do you confront death? How do you deal with relationship problems? All that kind of thing. And our concept really, when we founded the School of Life, was to take all the best knowledge from history and philosophy and literature and psychoanalysis and everything and kind of edit it down and make it practical and useful. And I got involved in the School of Life because I exactly love that idea. I mean, I had studied philosophy, politics, and economics at university, and I became a political scientist, but I'd always loved philosophy, but I hated it at university because it was so dry and abstract, and it just didn't feel like it was applied to life. So there was a lack of how to. Yes. So from working through the School of Life, very much trying to think about how do we make ideas practical, stuff that I can then do in my life. That's really influenced the kinds of books that I write, even though I love sitting in libraries and reading abstract philosophy and so on. I always try and think, okay, how the hell are we going to put this into practice? And to be honest, I am not the most practical person. I'm not like a serial entrepreneur that has ideas and then tries to set up organizations and things. I've set up a few, like the Empathy Museum I mentioned, or being involved with the School of Life, things like that. But I do at least like to write about the people who are trying to put the ideas into practice and champion their work.
Oh, no, and I, for one, I'm really grateful. I really like your books, and I love that combination of what you do with them. We'll dig into the book a little bit more, I reckon, now. Actually, there was one question, was it Gillian, who said, have you had a chance to share it with any of those traditional communities?
Yeah, so I've talked about the book and the ideas in the book with, for example, people from Maori communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah. In fact, I'm just about to do an event with some Iroquois leaders in the United States, and it's really kind of interesting because, and in fact, and then I also did a really interesting event also with a guy from the Molucca Islands in Indonesia, who said that they too have 7th generation decision making in their village councils. They look 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So it's been really interesting engaging with all these different cultures, but also people from different, for example, religions. I did an event the other day with a quite a famous Japanese Buddhist monk, and he was talking about how the two main traditions of Buddhism in Japan both in a way find long-termism in the stillness of the now, in a way, as sort of a stepping out of time. So kind of a different way of getting to it. And one of the things we talked about was how there's so much interesting long-term thinking in Japanese culture, partly because of the traditions of ancestor worship and so on. But like we know in Japan, there are more than 3,000 companies that are over 200 years old.
Yes.
Now, that's really interesting, isn't it? You know, and there are some companies in Japan that are 1,000 years old. They're like robe makers and brewers. And actually, I think I saw this amazing statistic the other day. Don't quote me on this, but it's something like 27% of the world's companies that are over 200 years old are in the alcohol business. They're like breweries, winemakers, whiskey distilleries. I can't remember the exact statistic. It actually comes from Alexander Rose, who's the executive director of the Long Now Foundation. He's doing some really interesting work on long-term organizations, what enables organizations to survive and maintain themselves. And he somehow found this number. I don't know if it's exactly 27%, something like that.
Wow, we're going to be looking that up, I'm sure, because our team are doing a project on long-termism, actually with sort of through Climate Kick. They've been doing a deep demonstration on how could it work within a place-based situation. So
yeah, Climate Kick's doing really great stuff around this, and have brought together Dark Matter Labs and some other really interesting organizations. And again, this is part of the Time Rebel movement I'm talking about. You know, that there's something like Climate Kick, which is kind of embedded in EU institutions and technological development, starting to think about 100-year bonds and all sorts of other aspects of long-termism.
Exactly, that's exactly what we've got ourselves embroiled in, which will be fun. And actually, you touched on it with the monk a little bit. This idea of, you know, living mindfully, being in the moment, being present, and still is becoming more and more popular, I guess, at least amongst some of us. How do you sort of compare that to the planning ahead with the acorn brain that you talk about? I love that acorn and marshmallow. It's brilliant. You know, is that the opposite? How do we reconcile the two, that we both do the planning ahead, but we also live for today, in a sense, mindfully?
Okay, well, let me just say something about that acorn and marshmallow brain stuff first, because probably some of the people listening to this are thinking like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, let me explain this. Here's a marshmallow, which I happen to handily have with me. So in my book, I talk about these two parts of the brain, the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. There's my acorn. And these really represent two parts of our neuroanatomy. So part of our brains are indeed wired for short-termism. That's the bit I call the marshmallow brain, named after the famous marshmallow test, where a marshmallow is placed in front of kids in this famous 1960s psychology experiment that you no doubt know about, Walter Mischel. And if kids could resist eating the marshmallow for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. And the majority of kids snatched the snack and gobbled it up. Now, the marshmallow test has been criticized for lots of reasons, like the wealthier the kids are, the less likely they are to take the marshmallows. It all depends on socioeconomic background and levels of trust and things like that. But the marshmallow brain really is part of who we are. You know, it's an 80-million-year-old part of our brain. That's what gets us clicking the buy now button. It's all about immediate rewards and instant gratification. But it is not the whole story of who we are, because we do have this other part, the acorn brain, which lives here in our frontal lobes, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you're interested in that stuff. And this is a new part of the brain. It's only a couple of millions of years old, but it's more developed in human beings than almost any other creature. So like a chimpanzee, right, will plan ahead. For example, they might get a stick, take off the leaves, and use it as a tool to stick into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of these tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what human beings do. We are long-term planners extraordinaire. We're experts at the temporal pirouette. Our minds can jump across time horizons. 1 minute we can be checking a text. The next moment we can be saving for our pensions or writing song lists for our own funerals. It's the acorn brain which has enabled us to build the Great Wall of China or the sewers of Victorian London or voyage into space, right? That's what it's all about. So now so I think that, there's always a struggle going on between these two parts of who we are. Do I party today or save for my pension for tomorrow? Do I upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? So that struggle's going on. We just need to create or change our institutions, our businesses, our governance, so the acorn brain comes out. But now getting back to your actual question about, well, how does that all relate to the idea of, say, mindfulness and being in the present? Well, I think there are different ways of switching on the acorn brain. So one way is to literally explicitly think about our futures and switch it on with behavioral measures, for example. So let me give you some great stats, which I recently found out. So listen to this. I think this is amazing. So if you are, when people are creating their pensions, writing their wills,
yeah.
In the UK, 6% of people leave a charitable bequest in their wills, on average, 6% of people. So that's leaving something for future generations. It could be for people or planet, it could be for a donkey sanctuary or for cancer research, British Heart Foundation, whatever. So people do leave stuff for future generations, 6%. But if you explicitly ask people, would you like to leave a charitable bequest in your will? Suddenly it jumps from 6% to 12%. And then if you say to people, a lot of people like leaving a charitable bequest in their will, is there a cause that you really care about? Suddenly it jumps up to 17%. So there, with just a few behavioral nudges, you can get people to make a connection with the future and literally give money to it, which is, I think, a pretty amazing thing. And to give money not just to their own kids, but to what I think of as the universal strangers of the future. So there's that way of connecting with the future. Another way is to do imaginative thought experiments, like I mentioned at the beginning, like I imagine my daughter when she's 90 years old. That can motivate me. But then another way is drawing on, mindfulness and things like that to try and disassociate ourselves from the hyper speed of the current world. And, you smell the flower today because it, may flower and die and not be around anymore. The more that we manage to engage with the present, in that deep mindful way, the more that we can, in a way, get a sense of eternity. The danger, though, is that, and this is where I've critiqued mindfulness a lot in one of my books called Carpe Diem Regained, or at least the corporate style of mindfulness, which is really about me, 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 me. How do I deal with my problems and my stress and my life? And a lot of mindfulness has been packaged that way. And I think it's lost touch with some of the deeper forms of mindfulness you find in the Buddhist tradition, for example, where you might do a mindful meditation where you're asked to try and empathize with or think about family and friends, a wider and wider social circle, but also ideally future generations. But let me say this, when I was talking to this Japanese monk I mentioned, one of the things he admitted to me, he said, and this was really interesting, he said, when I do meditation, this is broadly, roughly what he was saying, he said, I think I extend my moral circle outwards to people alive in today's world or to the living world today, but I don't do enough of it for future generations. So even though I'm trying to be mindful, it's a mindfulness across space rather than through time.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting, how he said that. He was really, I thought it was lovely and open of him, but I think quite realistic too. Yeah.
And he may have changed it now he's met and had that conversation.
But I think he was kind of there anyway. I mean, it was just, it's almost like a language thing. Sometimes we don't have the language for long-term thinking. And in a way, what my book a lot is about trying to give people the words to encapsulate things they might know or feel. So the idea of being a good ancestor, I think, connects with a lot. It's not my phrase. I stole it from the immunologist Jonas Salk, who was the guy who discovered the polio vaccine, developed, not discovered the polio vaccine back in 1955. But that idea that, I am an ancestor too. I find that incredibly motivating to feel those future generations judging me. And I think we could all sometimes feel a little bit of that sometimes, but to kind of name it as being a good ancestor, I think has a power.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you talked about training the acorn brain. One of the things I've been thinking about sort of through reading your book is how we train ourselves away from that marshmallow, if that's possible, but not just as individuals, but as far as I can see, we, as a society, we are, addicted to that marshmallow in terms of sugar, alcohol, drugs, shopping, social media, whatever we want to call it. And we should, just that, how you talked about governance as sort of bringing forth the acorn. Do you also see it as governance and regulation limiting the marshmallow in a sense? Is that our only way forward?
Well, I certainly think governance and regulation in all sorts of forms has a role in trying to keep our marshmallow brain at bay, to a certain extent. I mean, so for example, I understand that in France, they've introduced taxes on very sort of short-term share trades, sort of nanosecond share trades. I'm not sure exactly how it works or even how successful it's been, but I know that that's something I think that the French government introduced at some point. So a regulatory framework or approach to try and de-marshmallow the financial markets, right? And then you can imagine taking that a step further, saying, okay, if you trade your shares within one day, well, then you have to pay a 20% tax on your gains. But if you hold your shares for a week, maybe it goes down to 15%. If you hold them for a year, maybe it should be 10%. If you hold your shares for 20 years, maybe no tax at all. Yeah. And you can imagine that changing the financial markets overnight, particularly for things like investment in long-term renewable projects or something like that, got long time frames for the returns. So I definitely think there's a role for regulation in that sense. Of course, there's also an obvious role for government in creating the regulatory frameworks to enable the regenerative economy, yes. Right? To enable companies not having a fiduciary duty only to their shareholders, to create the space for the emergence of the B Corp movement, for example. All those kinds of things has to be done. And of course, some companies are, taking the lead themselves. I mean, the B Corp movement is exactly that, right? It's a voluntary framework or movement of, I don't know how many companies are B Corps now, maybe 2,500.
2,500, I reckon. Yeah.
Right? But there's some big companies there, right? Natura, the Brazilian cosmetics giant, which now owns Body Shop, and they bought Avon recently, I think. Yes. And they bought Aesop, the Australian one, right? Yeah. So, Natura, I find Natura really fascinating because it's not like it's just a small company like Houdini. I mean, they're big. Yes. And in fact, I was talking to the head of sustainability from Natura the other day, and he was saying, this is a real, like when they buy Avon, okay, right? Avon is, I guess, I don't know a lot about Avon, but they're pretty much, they use palm oil, they use this, that, they've got all sorts of
the full transformation.
Yeah, the changes that need to be made. Can Natura turn Avon around and bring it into that sort of B Corp mold, if not exactly a B Corp necessarily, but something a bit like it? Well, we'll see. So yeah, I definitely think, and I think there's one more sort of more general thing to say about governance, and which you raised in your question, which is there's this great framework you might know from Marjorie Kelly about business design. And she says, when you're thinking about any business, you need to think about, its purpose, networks, governance, finance, and ownership. And all of those need to be aligned. So if you're a bit like, if you've got, your purpose might be all about meeting social and environmental goals alongside your financial ones. But if your financing and your ownership is not aligned with that, in other words, you're just publicly owned by and subject to normal short-term shareholder pressures, then you're going to be challenged at certain points, right? And that's the kind of the story of Unilever, right? Paul Polman comes in as CEO as Unilever. The first day abolishes quarterly reporting. That's all good. Well done. But then, of course, he's still, the ownership of Unilever is still traditional. And then he's therefore subject to, I think in 2018, there was that Kraft Heinz, takeover threat, to Unilever. He's having to fight that stuff all the time. So then how do you put your sustainability plan in place if you don't have everything aligned? So, I mean, that's a very fundamental thing.
Piece of the whole thing. I think she calls it corporate schizophrenia, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Kelly. You know, it is really important, that alignment, I guess, and whether it's government helping to align that, or companies working on their own too. Now I've got to go and look a little bit, because I'm looking at I can see all these questions coming in. Actually, we can. So do you think that the sort of rise in importance of collaboration between business and government and other agencies will help activating that acorn brain and help us start to think longer term? Cool. So the fact, that's.
So say more. What are you going to say?
I was just going to say that was Jerry Carden has just said, given that there's that those types of collaborations are rising and in importance, is that going to help us, do you think? I've never
I have to admit, I haven't directly thought about that question. That makes it a really interesting question. Let me tell you what immediately comes to my mind. Amsterdam.
Yes.
Now, Amsterdam comes to my mind partly because, you know, as you probably know, that they are really innovative when it comes to their ecological targets. You know, they want to be 100% circular by 2050, 50% circular by 2030, no fossil fuel cars after 2030. And I think that means that's not about sale of fossil fuel cars. That means like no fossil fuel cars
not
allowed.
Like
here. Right. And then they've also adopted the donut economics model for coming out of their post. And I have to do a disclaimer here. My wife invented the donut economics model, Kate Rayworth. So I'm a bit of a fan of it. But you know, so Amsterdam has taken on the donut model of social and planetary boundaries for its post-COVID recovery, and I think Amsterdam's really interesting because in order to get into that donut-shaped space, in order to get rid of the fossil fuel cars, in order to become circular, that requires an enormous amount of cooperation between government and business, right? So you've got, you know, innovative companies based in Amsterdam. I mean, one that just comes to mind because I love eating their chocolate is Tony's Chocolonely. Knows Tony Chocolonely. I think they're the biggest chocolate company in the Netherlands. And my local Sainsbury's, they're now selling Tony's Chocolonely, right? Which is kind of highly ethical, as they call it, slave-free chocolate. But, you know, even Tony's Chocolonely will probably have to work really hard to meet those, to operate effectively in that regenerative regulatory environment, which the Amsterdam city mayor is trying to impose. So to kind of answer the question, you can look at somewhere like Amsterdam, and I think what's really interesting about Amsterdam is that there's a kind of peer-to-peer inspiration thing going on, because like when Amsterdam adopted the donut model earlier this year, well, then suddenly Copenhagen said, oh, we're going to use this for our financial planning and budgeting processes too. And then another city says they're going to do it. Then a region says they're going to do it. So I definitely think there's a kind of a peer-to-peer inspiration or a kind of demonstration effect going on, because ultimately I think there's a kind of an existential issue here. You know, ultimately you have to make a choice as a business or as a city councillor or whatever it is. You know, am I going to make this kind of leap to thinking longer, thinking more regeneratively? And you get your inspiration by seeing others do it, because you've never done it before, right?
Yeah.
You know? So you have to look for these examples, and more of them are emerging.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I may have bored you with this before. This idea of a Green Swans Observatory, where we are looking for those companies, organizations, places that are starting to display regenerative potentials, really, in order to try and shift us all exponentially towards regeneration. And people need them. The minute you talk about regenerative, they say, but give me an example. What's that company? Just jumping a little bit into these questions, I'm actually going to pick. So Tine is one of our very long-term members. I'm going to read it out. And Tine, if you want to jump in, then unmute yourself and tell me off. She says, this is such a remarkable book. I need to read it again more slowly. But I kept coming back to this one idea, which is maybe how I understand Waka Papa, that if people realize that time is not linear and that the past, present, and future actually exist together, then to think long-term for future generations, we would need to understand that we as individual souls may appear again in the future, different incarnations, even that those future selves are here now speaking to us, showing us how to act and think. If we are one collective consciousness, then surely this is all happening at the same time in different dimensions. Here comes the question. Do you think people's level of empathy, sense of responsibility for the future would stretch further if they knew they were coming back for several more lifetimes?
Oh, big question.
Yes, let's hear it up.
Okay, so let's try and have a little look into that question. That's really fascinating. So the first thing that was mentioned there was the Maori concept of whakapapa. It's spelt wakapapa, but WH in Maori apparently is pronounced with an F. So it's whakapapa, though that sounds slightly rude. And that's the Maori concept of lineage or genealogy, the idea that we are all in a great chain of life stretching long into the past and far into the future. And it so happens that the light is shining here and now. And what we need to do is shine it more broadly. So, you know, I once went to a talk by a Maori activist, a legal activist, and she said, while she was speaking, she said, you know, here I am speaking. This is roughly her speaking. She said, here I am speaking, but it's not just me here. They're the living, the unborn, and the dead are all here with me. My whole kind of lineage going into the past and future. And I thought that was fascinating because I certainly don't feel that when I'm speaking to you now. I don't feel my ancestors and future sisters all here in the room with me. And I think one needs to have come from a particular culture to really feel that deeply. Equally, people who, you know, are brought up with ideas of reincarnation, as intimated in the question there, may well feel that connection with future and past much more strongly than someone like me who's grown up in a hyper-individualistic consumer society. But the fact is that human beings are intergenerational creatures by nature. We have evolved to at least care about 5 generations. I mean, most of us will probably know our parents and might know our grandparents and may know our children if we have them and have grandchildren. There we are in the middle of a 5-generation line to start with. And if you think back to the date your grandparents were born and the date that your grandchild may die, okay, you're probably spanning 250 years there. So even in that kind of evolutionary sense of ourselves as sort of anthropological beings embedded in several generations, we're already making that connection, you know. And then I think it's up to us about how we're going to feel or approach that connection. You know, some people may get it through, okay, some sense of karma and reincarnation. I can connect in that way. Me personally, I do it by the strongest thing for me is to think about my children and their children and the world that they're going to live in. And I think the power of it, at least for me, is when I imagine my daughter when she's 90 in the year 2100 roughly, what I realize, and when I've done these kind of thought experiments, this kind of imaginative journeying, I realize that she's not alone in the world. She's surrounded by a web of family and friends and community that support her, and also the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the food she eats, the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. So there's something, you know, that's not about reincarnation, but it's certainly transcendental in some sense. It's sort of edging on collective consciousness. It's a recognition of kind of deep interdependence.
Yeah, and so in the book, I guess you could kind of give very neatly 6 tools. And do you have a sense of which are resonating more with people, or is it a mix? Because I know for me, I couldn't tell you, oh, this is exactly what motivates me.
Yeah. So yeah, the book has these 6 different types of long-term thinking, like deep time humility and intergenerational justice and transcendent goal, and these various ways of thinking about long-term thinking, like a conceptual toolkit. Now, so the question there is any one of them more powerful than any other, let's say? And on the one hand, I believe they all matter, and we need all of them. But when it comes down to it, when I'm talking to different groups of people about these ideas in this book, let's say a group of MPs. So I did a briefing about this book for British members of parliament, right? And one of the things I wanted to talk to them about was about discount rates, which I saw very quickly came up in the questions there. I didn't exactly see the question, but so I wanted to talk to them about changing the Treasury's discount rates, because, you know, as many of you will know listening here, the way discounting works, it's a bit like the further and further away somebody is from you when you're looking at them, the smaller and smaller they get. Well, that's how discounting works in government and investment decision making. The further and further away someone is from you in time, the less weight you put on their interests or welfare. And the result when it comes to government is that you know, like when the Treasury is making decisions, do they invest or put government money into a long-term renewable project? Basically, anything that has benefits accruing more than 50 or 60 years ahead is given no weight because of the discounting methodology. And everything is front-loaded towards present generations. And that is a gross intergenerational injustice, I think. So that's what I wanted to talk to MPs about, okay? But I didn't start by talking about that quite technical, complex issue. What I first started talking about was the idea of the legacies that they wanted to leave. The idea that they've got children and grandchildren who'll be alive in the 22nd century. The idea that there are 7.7 billion people alive today. And in the past 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born. But over the next 50,000 years, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. I mean, even in the next 2 centuries, tens of billions of people will be born. So that's why I tend to emphasize the idea of getting that sense of, well, what legacy, how are those future generations going to judge you? What's your legacy going to be? What's your legacy going to be for your family, for your community, for your country, for the living world? That kind of question, I think, works best. Now, I know some people go at this issue by talking about risk and probabilities of certain risks, right? And there's a value in that, you know, and that's how the IPCC reports are written, you know, and that's how a lot of work in strategic foresight operates. I mean, not only, but, you know, the idea of talking about risk. Now, I have found that talking about risks is not as effective as talking about legacy as a first step to getting people to care, whether particularly with groups of people in power, you know, big investors, politicians, people like that. But maybe that's also it's just my way as well. You know, I'm not a highly kind of technical sort of person in the way that I talk or think or write. I mean, I used to do lots of statistics when I used to be a political scientist, you know, and I got quite a lot of stats in my book, but I think I tend to go more for the kind of personal connection as a first step. And just sort of, you know, off the record, you know, I was having a conversation while I was writing the book, actually, with one of Britain's biggest hedge fund guys, probably almost the biggest. And we were having dinner, and I wasn't quite sure where I connected with this person as a person. You know, we have very different political and other outlooks, but I did ask him, I said, you know, what legacy do you want to leave? You know, why are you doing this? You know, all your investors, why are you doing this? And, you know, beyond just making money and so on. And he had an immediate answer. He said, you know, I really care about my legacy. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, I really admire those 19th century kind of Victorian philanthropists, you know, the people who like invested in railroads and canals and the sewers and that stuff, which is still around today. Yeah. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And I think that was genuine. He genuinely connected with that sense of well, 19th century philanthropy, and not just philanthropy, but as a kind of a long-term vision investor, a kind of a picture of something bigger than his own life or the immediate times. And I think that was really about legacy. You know, that legacy was what unlocked that bit of conversation we had.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. And people in power often will either think about risk or or legacy, but not really that in between. I'm going to pick up on, so first to say, so our friend Steve Waygood at Aviva, who you may have come across, he's the only person I've heard speak quite as passionately about discounted cash flow as you have, and you should definitely connect with him on it, because he is determined to abolish the way that's done. We've talked a little bit about, can you reverse it, so you have less discount if it has future impact.
That's a nice idea. Yeah.
But there's a lot of work to get that done. I'm going to pick that question you saw from Santiago Osa, who says that a light bulb went off for him or her, when I read the parallel you draw between financial discounting and the diminishing importance of future lives, to the point where future humans are in a way valued equivalent to how slaves were valued in the US. While I find the insight powerful, I wonder whether this parallel may be received with resistance, particularly amongst Black Lives Matter movement, and how would you respond to somebody who finds that somewhat offending?
Yeah, so that's a really, really fundamental question, because actually this book came out just at the time of when Black Lives Matters, had its biggest sort of growth and sort of explosion, as it were. And I was very conscious of a couple of things. One is that metaphor of colonizing the future and how that would be taken. Mm-hmm. The idea that I talk about discounting as being a bit like slavery. So in the sense that, there was this famous clause, that was in the US Constitution, basically, that the southern states, the slaves of the southern states were valued at 3/5 of a white person when it came to allocating congressional votes.
Yes.
Right? So only 60% of a white person. And in a way, and the way discounting works, with a discount rate of about 3 or 3.5%, which is what the UK Treasury uses, within about 30 years, future generations are treated at about the value of 60% of someone today. So there's a kind of equivalence there.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, so there's a question of, let's say, cultural sensitivity around this. Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you what I found, which is really, really interesting. Oh, let me raise one more issue here, which is really important. One thing that people often ask me, and I don't know if this has come up in the text, but is think being a good ancestor something about white privilege, something that only middle-class, well-off people worry about? Because if you are just dealing with the problems of here and now, if you are, if you're one of the world's 220 million refugees, and they're going to be 450 million refugees and migrants by 2050, well, then you're just dealing with your problems here and now. How could you possibly be thinking about the long term? And I understand that from my dad was a refugee from Poland to Australia after the Second World War. He was just trying to make ends meet. He was trying to find somewhere to live in the middle of a massive housing crisis and deal with racism and all sorts of stuff. So, but what I found really interesting now, to actually answer the question, when it comes to things like Black Lives Matter, is I've had lots of conversations with African American activists and Black British activists in the movement about this. And what I found is that they recognize that their struggles which I identify with very much, are very much intergenerational struggles. So there's a well-known book called Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad.
Yeah.
And she talks on page 1 about being a good ancestor, because it's a recognition, I think, that so many of the problems around racial injustice have come out of long-term histories of colonialism and slavery. And those problems are being passed on from generation to generation because they are embedded in policing systems and judicial systems and education and culture more broadly. So racial injustice is a deep, deep, long-term issue that requires looking to the past and looking to the future in order to understand it. And I think I hope my book really speaks to that. And I write about that stuff in the book. So yeah, I don't think there's a kind of a conflict issue there. And one other thing just to say with regard to that thing about, well, if you're someone who's just dealing with your living on the social margins, you're a temp worker, you've lost your job during COVID, are you only thinking about here and now? And so is long-termism just for the privileged? Well, again, not only have you found that discussion of intergenerational justice emerging in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in indigenous communities, like in Maori communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's huge discussion about long-termism, even though these are communities often who are economically, socioeconomically on the margins, definitely not privileged peoples, but there's the deep culture of stewardship and long-term thinking, which we have an enormous amount to learn from. So I think there's not just a clear sort of socioeconomic kind of binary about how we think about long-term, short-termism.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that actually was asked by Lawrence, who's jumped off to cook Thanksgiving supper, I think. So we'll take that off. I'm going to jump a little bit to more business type things. And Raj has put up here, a new paper by some academics I trust argue that corporate executives take advantage of short-termism narrative to avoid shareholder accountability. This narrative of short-termism is self-defeating. Have you read it or have any views that they're basically taking advantage of that short-termism to avoid?
You know, I don't have views on that, actually. I haven't really thought about it. I can just tell you what comes to my mind.
Yes.
You know, in my book, I talk about how we've not only got greenwashing, but what's something that's now emerging is long washing. And what I mean by that, I mean companies saying that they're being long-term, but only in a very, very narrow way. So in other words, their long-termism is just dedicated towards, you know, things like profits and revenues and market share and all the traditional stuff. You know, there's this quote I came across in my research from a former head of Goldman Sachs called Gus Levy. Back in the 1970s, he said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. So that's a kind of long-termism, a kind of cathedral thinking, which is one of the 6 ways to think long-term I put in my book. But the question is what it's directed towards. And I think of that kind of thing as an attitude of kind of long washing, you know, trying to embrace the long-term language for quite narrow ends. But I can totally imagine, of course, that I don't know enough about the legal aspects of it, but certainly I get the sense that lots of companies and CEOs say, oh, well, we have to obey our shareholders and we have to meet those short-term targets, even though legally they're not always obligated to do so. And so actually they've got choices to make that could shift towards integrating more long-term governance structures in their businesses, but they're choosing not to take them for various reasons. But I really have no expertise in this area. So Brody, you or John or many other people on the call should really answer that question.
And I think I would agree with, I think it was Raj who asked the question on that, yes, that is used as an excuse, but actually there's also, I'm at least seeing the opposite, that a lot of execs want to do the right thing. But they're not really sure how. And I guess that's part of our job, and this book's job is how do you do that? How do you embrace doing the right thing as a human being, which every executive is, I would hasten to add.
Yeah, and that's what's so powerful about this, because every executive, every politician is a human being. And if you're able to look them in the eye, you know, and have a conversation about things like legacy, you know, very few people don't care about other people. You know, very few people, you know, occasionally, you know, you might have a conversation with someone about their legacy, and they're like a Russian oligarch who wants to have or they just want to have a wing of the National Gallery named after them, or a football stadium or something. That's a sort of very egotistical form of legacy. But most people, you can take them a few steps away to something broader than that.
It strikes me, and I haven't thought about it before, so I hope this is solid, a little bit that we're seeing a rediscovery of people as good people fundamentally, whereas we've built systems over the last decades and maybe longer that assume people are rational and not essentially good, and that there's some of that conflict going on.
Yeah, and these are long-term institutional changes, and we're seeing them played out in our education system. So, you know, I'm just thinking my kids at school, the way education is still pretty much set up is through competition rather than cooperation.
Yes.
Right? And that's how their exams work and so on. But at least very slowly since the 1990s, in a way, since Daniel Goleman wrote his book on emotional intelligence, we are seeing new kinds of values being taught in schools, things like empathy that I'm very interested in. There's a program called Roots of Empathy based in Canada. Over 1 million kids have done it. They bring a baby into the classroom. The kids try and imagine what it's like to be the baby. They bring a real live baby in, and all that kind of thing is challenging in a deep way that sort of hyper individualistic competitive nature, which is required, I think, to develop those more cooperative values and attitudes.
Yes, no, I agree. And I think, I don't know if Marissa's on here, but yes, she's doing work exactly in that in the US, in teaching empathy and other kind of qualities like that. I'm going to jump back to the business because I'm suddenly realizing a lot of business and politics questions I haven't touched on yet. In terms of long term, and you did kind of touch on it briefly, but most business and finance people think 3 years is long term, maybe 5 years, at a push 10, but really at the moment it's just surviving COVID and the next 18 months. And yet, in the book you're talking about 100-year planning. And I know one company that I work with that have created 100-year plans for some Mongolian herding areas to develop cashmere and so on, but I don't know any other business that thinks like that. I guess one is, do you think it's realistic to extend that timeline out longer, or what is needed to do it? Actually, what will it take?
Yeah, I mean, I don't run businesses myself. I don't have shareholders yapping at me, investors yapping at my toes, that kind of thing. So I'm not the best person to answer the question, but I've tried to think about it and noticed, of course, that first thing we need to grasp is that throughout history, humans have embarked on very, very long-term projects. Sometimes governments have done it. Sometimes companies have done it. Sometimes communities have done it. The classic idea is the cathedral, where like the famous case is Ulm-Minster in Southwest Germany, where the citizens of Ulm decided they wanted to build their own church in the year 1377. They'd finance it themselves. Well, it took them over 500 years. They didn't finish until 1890, probably the world's longest crowdfunding project. And that involved local businesses and politicians and stonemasons and all sorts of people. It was a massive communal effort. But what made it possible, we don't exactly know, but we know it probably had something to do with, religious fervor, dogged determination, but also a sense that their institution, in that sense, the church, was going to last for hundreds of years, and they were embedded in a community. And knowing and believing that their institution was going to be around that long made them think it's worthwhile starting on building this cathedral, even though they're never going to see it finished, built, themselves. And I think you find that in business too. You see certain people. I mean, even who's the guy I'm trying to think of? The guy who founded SoftBank, Masayoshi Son, I think his name is. He talks about having a 300-year plan for his,
which is just lovely,
business, right? And I mean, so he's investing in the really long term, a lot of AI investment, for example. And yeah, he's going to see the fruits of some of that, but then it will be passed on. And I think in Japan, I might be wrong about this, but I think they've got this amazing law where you can adopt an adult into your family to basically take over your business. I can't remember what it's called, but so there's a very high proportion of adopted adults in Japan. I'm sure this is right. I can't remember what it's called, but that's just partly what's used to keep these companies surviving for the long term. They don't actually always give the business to their children. They give it to someone in the business who's shown themselves and proven themselves to be committed to it. And then it gets passed on, it gets passed on, it gets passed on. So I think, again, there's this, you can look to places like Japan and other countries too, to these very long-lived companies and institutions, the Marylebone Cricket Club, all sorts of places. And then you can start asking yourself, okay, maybe it isn't so crazy for my business to think about having a 100-year sustainability plan. Or maybe it isn't so crazy, at least to think about the impacts of whatever I'm doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, and what those might be. So in my book, I've got this diagram called Human Time Horizons, where it kind of maps out the kinds of things we do on different time cycles. So, on the cycle of minutes, we're looking at our phones or having sex or whatever. On the cycle of hours, we're maybe, going shopping. On the cycle of years, we're maybe saving for a holiday. Cycle of decades, where we've got our mortgages. And the cycle of centuries, we might literally be planting trees in our garden, and I think any business can look at all those, whenever they're making a big decision on those different cycles, how are those different cycles being played out, or where does this particular decision sit? Is it something that's kind of working on a 3-month cycle or a 30-year cycle?
Longer term
like
cycle,
that.
yes.
Yeah. So I think all those things are sort of feasible ways to start thinking longer term.
Yeah, no. Reminds me of my cousin when he bought his house 15 years ago. He explained where he was going to put the trees. Right. And I remember thinking, he said, oh, we're going to sit here and there. And now, of course, he has the most beautiful, he lives in the middle of the countryside in Denmark and has the most beautiful trees.
Right, exactly. I used to work as a gardener at an Oxford college. I used to be an academic, and then I went from the high table to the low table. I worked as a gardener at an Oxford college, and we were planting trees for 100, 200 years from now, because we knew, for example, like the willow trees by the riverbank in this Oxford college I worked in, we're probably going to die within 50 years. Yeah. And the college fellows were saying, wait, why are you planting all these trees? And we had to take them as gardeners on a bit of a journey to think long term. But in fact, I mean, this was in Oxford, but a lot of, say, Oxford colleges are really interesting examples. Merton College, Oxford, when they rebuilt their library, they had a 250-year plan. I mean, they built it big enough and sturdy enough to last that long. And in fact, interestingly, the CEO of the renewable energy company, Good Energy, Juliet Davenport, went to Merton College. She was a student at Merton College. She studied physics there. And she apparently was really inspired by Merton College's 250-year library when she's been thinking about Good Energy. And Good Energy is a really interesting company in this way, that she talks about the company having not just shareholders and stakeholders, but future holders. Who are those future customers, communities going to be? They need a kind of place at the boardroom table.
Yes. And actually, it reminds me of the Ingram Pin cartoon that John had commissioned about, I want to say 15 years ago, he's going to correct me now, but where around the table was a robot, as well as representatives of the Global South and others. Exactly that. And it seemed so far out at the time, but unless you bring the future in, then not. And we've got, thank you, Gary, Yoshi-engumi.
The act of adopting an heir. There it is. I wasn't making it up, was I?
Nope. No, it's perfect. I really haven't heard of that. And I can see Carrie's put in a question that looks like it's about trees. So let's take that straight away. I wonder how we can reconcile the notion of long-term thinking, i.e. planting the trees to thrive 100 years, when we're staring down the gauntlet of the 8-year time horizon that Greta keeps reminding us of. And actually I had it on a list from somebody else, this idea of marrying up long-termism with urgency that Richard also asked.
Yeah, there's a real kind of tension in there, isn't there? Because, and almost a contradiction, a paradox, that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. If it is the case that we've got this 10-year window, particularly on climate issues to act, we have to do that now. But of course, we're doing it with the mindset of thinking long-term. We are looking at, as Greta is looking at, sea level rises, IPCC reports. Their predictions, some of them are 500 years ahead, right? Particularly on things like on sea level rises. They've got 500-year forecasts. May not be very accurate, but we know at least where things are going in 100 years from now, and that's what we need to act on when we're acting urgently today. So I think there's a set of long-term issues which require absolute urgent action. The window is very small, particularly the ones around the ecological crisis. But there's another set of long-term issues, which are ones which are going to be with us for a very long time, like around regulating AI and synthetic biology, for example. Yeah. That's going to be an ongoing issue. There is partly a kind of a window, a small window in some sense, because if you fail to get the right regulations in place now, it's going to be a mess in the future. In fact, I was on a call recently with UK government departments on engineered biology, trying to, developing the UK government's policies and regulatory framework on synthetic biology, because I'm not sure it's very well developed yet, to put it mildly. And, there's a lot of big issues there about, ownership, intellectual property. For example, if you can design babies using CRISPR technology, which is basically like cut and paste on Word, cut and paste on on Microsoft Word, but putting it towards genes, this is going to have massive impacts. But that issue is not going away. In fact, when I've talked to some people who work in deep mind and talking about AI and artificial general intelligence, a lot of them, when they're honest, are sort of thinking, well, that's maybe not coming for another 50, 100 years, maybe longer. So those are really long-term issues. We're always going to be dealing with them. But yeah, there is this tension I constantly feel about the need to try and have that long-term vision, 100 years for trees, but the urgency of doing it now. But ultimately, I don't feel that there's a contradiction. It's just absolutely clear how important it is for that question, am I being a good ancestor, to be something we habitually ask ourselves.
Yes. And maybe what we need is, you talked about the diagram, maybe we need one for business and governments, of what you need to deal with, like your house is on fire, what you need to deal with, but you have a bit more time.
Yeah, and that would be nice to do that, to sort of to lay it out. So it's kind of, it's almost like not a manifesto, but a memorandum, something that you'd always have on the table.
Exactly. Just keep checking. Where does this fall into?
Yeah, and these things, actually, this just relates to another question I saw in the chat, which was, I think, from John about the white horse of Uffington. He asked, what did you learn from upholstering the Uffington horse? Can I just, because this relates to this point, actually. So many of you will probably know that about 20 miles south of Oxford, which is where I happen to live, is this amazing Bronze Age artwork called the White Horse of Uffington, which has been carved into the mountainside of the chalk hill. And basically it's this 100-foot long horse, which is where the grass has been gouged out. So you can see the white bit that's left, and 100-foot long. You can see it from miles around. It's more than 3,000 years old. Now, the thing about the White Horse of Uffington is that we know that for at least 1,000 years, the local villagers were going up to the White Horse every year in a kind of ritual, a ceremony where they did what was called chalking the horse. So that meant that they were taking out the weeds which have grown up through the chalk and then getting new chalk, little bits of rock, and then bashing them in to re-whiten the horse, re-chalk the horse. And now that site is run by the National Trust. And last year I went with some colleagues from the Long Now Foundation's London outpost to be part of this ritual where members of the public can go along and re-chalk the horse. Okay, and so this is about, and it was an amazing thing to do, and we're now doing it every year, though we couldn't this year because of COVID, or couldn't in the last summer. So, but this is about maintenance. In a way, it goes back to what we were talking about, those Japanese companies, like, of course, most of the ones that have lasted for a long time are family firms. They're small. They have this sort of sense of not wanting to grow, but they're trying to maintain, look after, do what they do well, whether it's making tea in a Kyoto tea shop or whatever it happens to be. But in a sense, this maintenance stuff is also about ritual, and it's about habits of mind. And that's, when I was talking about the idea of, for a business, for a government to have that question, am I being a good ancestor, sort of there in our minds when we're making decisions. I think that's the kind of, at its deepest level, the value change we need to make. It's a kind of consciousness, isn't it? I mean, it's a way, going back to that Maori idea of the living, the dead, and the unborn being here in the room with us.
Yes, bringing them in to the decision making.
Yeah, just let them remind us that they're there. And we need to create those reminders, create those habits, create those rituals, however you do it in your business or in your community, in your family.
Agreed. And I'm going to push you a little bit. Okay, there's a question from Carrie that kind of carries on from that, which is about what can we do to get these ideas embedded into the mainstream culture soon enough? What are the opportunities for collaborative action and the collective impact that could enhance our single impact and kind of ensure success in the short to the medium term as well?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely not a kind of a time for individual action. It's not a light bulb changing time. It's just too urgent for that, particularly given the ecological crisis. So we need collective action, and I absolutely believe in collective action. So, you know, in my book and in real life, I try and support and talk about those movements which are collective ones, like the future design movement in Japan I mentioned, which is a form of citizens' assembly. In effect. And so I've done a lot of work recently trying to support moves to create new public decision-making mechanisms which bring in future generations. So like in Wales, you will know there's a Future Generations Commissioner, Sophie Howe, and I'm involved in the campaign for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner as well. And that in the UK bill, which is in Parliament at the moment, it will also have a citizens' assembly element to it. So you'd have like 100 random selected members of the public who would be involved in helping advise a UK Future Generations Commissioner. So we need things like that. We need to engage in legal battles. In the United States, there's an organization called Our Children's Trust, which has filed a landmark case against the US federal government on behalf of 21 young people campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. So that's a kind of collective thing as well.
What's the court case we need to take in the UK, do you think, on that?
Well, of course, the UK is a slightly different kettle of fish because it doesn't have a written constitution. So it's not about fighting the, you know, legal battles. But I know George Monbiot and the guy who founded Ecotricity, Dale,
Yes.
can't remember his name. They've been involved in a legal case, which sort of has some of the same implications. And there's been another one in the Netherlands called Urgenda, which is similar as well. So you have to adapt to your legal system, but those collective legal struggles are really important. And of course, it's about, you know, working together to create collective ecosystems. It's not enough for Houdini, that Swedish company, to be circular by itself. You need a whole ecosystem of companies to be doing that, you know, as well, you know, which is partly, you know, the kind of work that a lot of people on this call are all involved in. So these are collective struggles, but also I think it's about deep cultural change. I'm just thinking, leaning up on my shelf here, I'm going to recommend a book to you. The new sci-fi novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry for the Future. Right? We need people like Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a real long-term thinker, to help us, you know, change our cultural conversation. We need films, we need novels. You know, this book is about, he normally sets his books in the like 23rd or 24th century, stuff like that, 22nd century. This one is set about 5 years from now, 2025. And it's about how people tried to deal with the fact that the Paris Accord, climate accord, wasn't being put into practice and what happened in the decades when they did try and do something about it. Is it deeply depressing? Book. Sorry?
It's not deeply depressing, is it?
You know, it's the real world. It's a mixture of incredibly depressing and frustrating, but also unbelievably energizing.
Oh, good.
And
we can have that last bit.
And hopeful. And that's why Kim Stanley Robinson is the best sci-fi writer, I think, around today, because his books, they're very kind of messy in terms of, you know, let me just show you another one. Sorry, I'm a Kim Stanley Robinson binge person, but New York 2140. If you want to understand the future economy, read this book. It's about when New York is underwater, 50 feet underwater. He calls it a super Venice made of canals. Well, what you find there is a real mixture of innovative capitalism and property market speculation alongside the rise of anarchist-style mutualism in the housing market and all sorts of things going on. I think it's probably pretty realistic.
Fantastic. That's great. I know some of us are reading some Chinese sci-fi at the moment.
Oh, yeah, probably this.
Yeah, there he is.
Three-body problem.
There you go. Yes, exactly.
I've got this is my sci-fi libraries right here. Great book. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, sci-fi is really interesting. I could keep going with questions. I'm actually just going to ignore, there are little questions and lots of people saying good night and goodbye. Just want to bring you back to something I thought was really beautiful in the book, which was this idea of making space for the deeply personal in all this and falling in love with a place. Do you want to just talk us through that, and which place are you thinking of when you talk about which place you've fallen in love with?
Yeah, so long-term thinking is not just about time, it's about place. It's not just about having your 100-year sustainability plan, thinking long-term in that sense, but it's about regenerating the world that we live in. The Janine Benyus, this wonderful biomimicry thinker who I know John Elkington knows and been involved with, she asked this question, you know, how have other species managed to live for 10,000 generations or more, you know, and have that be long-term in that sense? She says, well, what they've learned to do is to take care of the place that will take care of their offspring. They're not going to be around in 10,000 generations. So what they've learned to do is to live within the boundaries of their ecosystem. In other words, to not foul the nest. That's how they survive for so long. That's how they care for the generations, by staying within the biocapacity in which they're embedded. And that's what humans have failed to do systematically in the last 100 years, with the great acceleration pushing us over planetary boundaries of CO2, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. So what Janine Benyus says is we need to, in a way, fall in love with place if we're going to think long term. We need to fall in love with savannas and mountains and ice sheets and swamplands. And she quotes this beautiful Mohawk blessing, which is spoken when a child is born. Thank you, Earth. You know the way. And I think all of us can try and find a bit of that earth that we can, you know, connect with. You know, for me, I happen to live 5 minutes from the Thames River, and I'm obsessed with the wildflowers that grow on the edge of the riverbank, you know, and I sort of feel like a custodian of them. I like to look after them, you know, as much as I can, but looking after them is really about letting them go. And I think that's why the rewilding movement is so powerful as well. A kind of a falling in love with the living world by letting it do its thing, letting the trophic cascades come back, you know, letting it regenerate itself rather than trying to manage. So yes, let's fall in love with the places that we know and care about and that we've grown up with.
Wonderful. And we are just about bang on time there. Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like there's so many other things we could go into, but this has been brilliant, and I can see everybody saying thank you and enjoying it. Thank you all for joining, and we will be in touch about, we'll have a slightly different session for December, rather than one person, but for now, Roman, thank you.
Well, and thank you so much. And they were really stimulating questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about more of them, but my brain's totally buzzing. So thank you all very much.
Oh, no. Yes, me too. I can see John's unmuting himself. Is that to say something?
I was expecting a wave of thank you. So I was just going to thank you, Roman.
Thank you. And happy Thanksgiving to all those celebrating. Most of them will have jumped off by now, I think. And for all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye all.
That was
Thank
brilliant.
you so much.
Really good.
Thanks a lot.